romantic naturalism. It's romantic small n naturalism. It's not the same as the French naturalism of Zola. Neither is it to be confused with the American late 19th century naturalism with a big N. For a couple of examples, Stephen Crane and Jack London. Well, French naturalism. Naturalism was a literary movement of particular social urgency that flourished during the first decades of the Third Republic. Its outstanding gift being the 20 novels of Zola and Macquart, though its ramifications can also be traced by reference to those writers referred to both affectionately and disparagingly as the little naturalists. There's a lot to be read about them, right? This includes Flaubert. We're not talking about them. We're talking about these small n naturalists who just want to put nature at the center of our existence. And it's a little bit different from what happened about 50 years, 70 years, 80 years, in some cases almost 100 years later, okay, in both France and in America. The Americans, for example, some of you from About the Americans, some of you who are in my 200 sections will recognize Crane, Stephen Crane, mentioned above, as the author of The Open Boat. And Jack London is the author of To Build a Fire. And both of these works pit the human against forces of an indifferent natural world, with the latter usually winning. Nothing could be further from the romantic naturalism of the Wordsworths and the Coleridges and of the Romantic period in general. Before moving on to Wordsworth and Coleridge, Wordsworth, of course, being our first major naturalist, a romantic naturalist poet, why don't we talk a little bit more about Blake? I had you read Thel, right? Could we say that Thel is afraid of nature? I think that that's not a bad way to think about what happens in this story. And I'm going to be featuring what you guys had to say on the discussion board. Allie had to say this: Thel runs back into the Vale of Horror because of the frightening reality of mortality and decay. When she enters the, quote, land of sorrows and of tears where never smile was seen, she's terrified and cannot handle the idea that life, even when beautiful, always comes with change, loss, and ultimately an end. Quote, she fears and fears. She fears and wants to avoid death and responsibilities that come with experience, which Blake suggests are essential for spiritual and moral growth. That's Bray. This fear is made clear when Blake writes, the virgin started from her seat and with a shriek fled back unhindered till she came into the vales of Hard. You remember, that's the end of the story. And as Olivia says, I would argue, and I agree with Olivia, that this is a mistake. Fair enough. Thel's about an innocent fearing and fleeing disastrously from experience. One expects her life back home, to which she returns, such as it is, to prove dissatisfactory, even more aimless, even more pointless than it did before. Because after all, she wanted to leave Hard to begin with because she felt useless. This is a quote. She's saying this about herself. Thel is like a watery bow, like a rainbow, and like a parting cloud, like a reflection in a glass, like shadows in the water, like the dove's voice, like transient day, like music in the air. The irony, then, is that she recognizes, even while in horror, she will not escape transience, right? She will indeed, quote, vanish from her pearly throne, even if she stays. Thus, Elizabeth, I do wonder if, quote, eternal life in the Vales of Horror is really at issue, and whether that's really what she returns to in running from the world of experience. I'll have more to say about this in the plate that follows. She wants to leave then. She wants to leave Horror to begin with because she wants to matter in all senses of the world. Something she cannot do if she stays. And Rachel is correct. The entire reason Thel left the valley is because she felt discontented. She had no useful role there. But in order to matter, to be of use, she will have to accept loss, pain, hurt. Real things matter as watery bows do not. They can get things done in the world. They can serve others. For example, note what the cloud tells her is quoted by Bridget. If thou art the food of the worms, O virgin of the skies, how great thy use, how great thy blessing. Everything that lives not alone for itself. And Noah, I think, is correct when he writes here, Thel's being taught the idea of interconnectedness and how our connection and impact on other living things gives our lives meaning. But, sometimes our lives are given meaning by our lives not flourishing, right? They flourish, like morally or what have you. They flourish in use, but in the process, we kind of use ourselves up, right? And Blake thinks we should not be afraid to do that. Thus dying meaningfully, talking about using yourself up, using yourself all the way up and dying. Dying meaningfully, usefully, it's going to be scary. It's going to hurt. It's simply fading away as the harbound Thel will do, will not, right? So one could argue that she ends up fearing not so much the end of experience, death, as she does the trauma of experience, which is like pain and fear and hurt. She fears, as I've said before in talking about what Blake doesn't like it when we fear itself. And I think Thel could be brought forward as someone who does. John Milton has this to say about the innocence, the condition of innocence represented by Thel, because she is almost like a character in the Songs of Innocence, maybe even the Songs of Experience, as we see innocence bordering upon experience and finally being shattered by it or scared off by it. This is what Milton had to say a long time before Blake did his writing. Milton liked Blake, or I should say, Blake liked Milton a lot, and actually wrote a book called Milton Down the Road. And this is what Milton had to say, and I think that they share this attitude towards the sort of innocence that Blake is talking about in this poem. An innocence that has been prolonged, an innocence that is, well, it's become, as Milton calls it, a fugitive and cloistered virtue. Milton wrote in Areopagitica, I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue such as Thel's innocence, unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out, not until that last moment, and sees her adversary, but slinks out of the race where that immortal garland is to be run for, not without dust and heat. Well, does Thel slink out? No, she bolts, right? Leading us to this conclusion. Innocence has its limits. We see that as represented by Thel. It should not be preserved at all costs. Should not be preserved, period. Right? And Kimberly has some interesting things to say about this question. Thel's, quote, frantic flight in the end displays that if you open the door to questions, honest answers to which you're not ready to hear, it's best to keep that door closed. And that's so well said. However, I would amend it slightly, Kimberly. I think Thel's flight and the larger book of which it is a part show that you should not get yourself into such a fearful condition to begin with. You should not prize your innocence to the point that you wish to preserve yourself as is, intact, virginal, and you back away from the world accordingly, fearful of losing something. We see that that's just simply not a good course of action for Blake. Now, on the ending of Thel, which was of some interest to you, several of you responded to this item. Note how Thel approaches the grave, the pit, and here's the voice emanating from it. It is a voice of experience with a big E, and it should remind you, in its questioning, of Theotorment from Visions of the Daughters of Albion, and the speaker of the tiger, as well as the opening of the human abstract. Now, this speaker is not sitting down midlife with holy fears, as we see the speaker do in those poems, right? This speaker, the speaker in the grave, is lying down. This is really Thel's image of her own end of life. This speaker, as Thel imagines it as herself, it is her own grave plot that she is visiting. And she imagines that she will be lying down at life's end, right? Not midlife, but at life's end, with just such holy fears and doubts. Though in this case, worse, because they're still extant, even at end of life. They're still pressing, and they're still harassing you at the end of your life. She intuits that, as John says, there will be moments of certainty one can experience for only a period of time, or only for a period of time, those moments of certainty, which then are shattered by circumstances, right? And that's a very disturbing thing to have happen. Thel here imagines her own life beyond horror in the world of experience being lived out amidst such shattered sureties, right? And abiding doubts and fears that never go away, but just become more intense as time passes. Life will prove a fearsome riddle. You'll go to your grave with that fearsome riddle, right? Harassing you as you can't even die peacefully. The questions keep coming and the questions multiply. And your life ends with doubts about God's wisdom, or even his very existence. Now, you might wonder why I'm dragging God into the picture, but I'll try to explain. You see what's behind some of those questions. It's a wonderful set of little questions there at the end of the poem, right? These are, of course, imagined. They are to be seen as imagined by Thel, as Thel imagines her own end, right? The end of her life in the world of experience. What does she imagine will happen? She'll be lying in her deathbed, as it were, actually in the grave itself, still beset by these harassing questions. Here's one of them. Why cannot the ear be closed to its own destruction, or the glistening eye to the poison of a smile? And then you drop down a little bit to lines 17 and 18. Why an ear? Why is an ear a whirlpool fierce to draw creations in? Why a nostril wide, inhaling terror, trembling and affright? Again, Thel is imagining herself finishing life as she lies in the grave, beset by doubts that have just multiplied over the course of long experience. But look at the nature of the doubts, and that, I think, makes this especially poignant and especially interesting. And it also justifies what I had to say about God's presence, or his absence, really. His absent presence, his present absence. Look at the nature of the doubts. She asks, why has the body been designed the way it has? So vulnerable, so unable to guard against painful, hurtful experience. And you can see this is a very interesting way of thinking about it. I mean, look at the ear. You cannot not hear stuff, right? And it's like the design of the ear. You might think we have some kind of an ear lid as opposed to we have an eyelid. Okay. What he has to say about the eye is, the eye can be closed to its own destruction, right? The eye you can't close your eyes and therefore, for example, avoid temptation. But the glistening eye is so entranced by certain smiles, even when those smiles are poisonous, that it doesn't want to shut. Okay, so there he's complaining about the eye just being so easily distracted and easily enchanted by an appearance of gorgeousness or what have you, right? But which is poisonous, as it turns out, because it hides the truth about that object that you happen to be beholding in that moment. The ear doesn't even have a lid. It doesn't even have there's no such thing as an ear lid. We have an earlobe, but not an ear lid. So it cannot be closed to music that perhaps is, enchanting you. And think of the sirens singing that Ulysses hears in Homer, right, in the Odyssey, and his boatmates are lured to their destruction, right, and their ears cannot be closed to their own destruction. He, of course, ties himself up because he was so distrustful of his own nature, and you could argue, as she would say, of his own ears, that they're just not going to be able to resist this sound. And you see, this bugs her. Even on her deathbed, she's like, why are we built this way, right? Look at the ear. You cannot hear stuff unless maybe your little brother or little sister used to do when you were telling them the truth. He or she would put hands up to the ears and make a loud sound. So he or she wouldn't have to listen to what you're saying, right? It's about the only way you can avoid hearing something. And she sees this as like a sign of a poor design, or maybe even a malevolent design. Look at the eye, so easily fooled that what glistens is gold. Look at the nose. It cannot help, she says, but inhale. You know how that goes. When we're grossed out by a smell, it's very difficult. I mean, we can sort of stop up our noses, I suppose. But that first inhalation of whatever it was that smells so evil, we have no guard against it. And it seems to invade our very beings, right? So it prompts this question, who designed this thing, right? You've heard of the arguments from design. There's certain arguments, the ontological argument for the existence of God from design. And I'm sure you're aware that there are many who have argued against evolution, and they want to believe in creation. They are called creationists, and often more sophisticated creationists will argue from design, and will accept this argument. It's sometimes, as I said, referred to as the ontological argument, okay, for the existence of God on the basis of design. And you can see how this speaker here, who is really Thel, as Thel imagines herself at the end of life, okay, would be engaged in this kind of argument, right? Who designed this thing? Who designed all of it? Who designed the rest of it? Well, there's only one answer to that question. God did, right? And you can see at this point we're very close to where we were in those other poems that I mentioned to you. You know, we're close to those questions Theo Tormund was asking in Visions. We're close to the questions being asked by the speaker of the tiger, as well as the figure who sits down with holy fears in the human abstract, having made those observations that we get in the first 4 lines of that poem, right? And you see how this could end. It could end like this. Who designed this thing? Who designed the rest? Well, God did, right? So we have been told. What? Well, why? just to torment us? What sort of God is that? How dare he? And I use that word dare, I put it in quotation marks, hoping to remind you of that last line of, as we saw in a previous one of these micro lectures, that last line in The Tiger, where we have a repetition of the opening stanza, but how what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry becomes what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry. And you have in this moment an exercise in theological audacity on the part of the speaker, who is actually saying, look, this is not a God I really want to worship. That's the next step, right? This is very audacious theologically, right? And the only real way to deal with this, perhaps, and still be a believer when you're in a moment like that, is to recoil from your own theological audacity into talk, as we have seen. This is what the human abstract's all about, from the Songs of Experience, into talk of God's mysterious ways. You remember the tree of mystery. God's ways are mysterious to men, unknowable to men. We've seen this before, in other words. Now, in Thell's case, we don't see the process through as we do in these other works, especially in the human abstract. She just runs, right? And as we presume, she resumes her pointless rainbow existence, as Danielle puts it, trying to rewind, in a sense, which I thought is a nice way of thinking about it. And it's just not going to probably work. I think she's going to be even more miserable than she was before, right? Because she's going to have this memory of a bigger world of use that she has forsworn. But no, this is very important. Note how she freaks. What is the precise moment that freaks her out so that she bolts? And it is only precisely when questions about the body, right, the ears, the eyes, the nose, move from ears and eyes and nose and whatnot to the lower body, right? And we get these questions about the anatomical structure of the human body, and especially of her own human body as a female virgin. She asks, why a tender curb upon the youthful burning boy? Why a little curtain of flesh on the bed of our desire? And that is, of course, the hymen, to put it somewhat poetically, that is being talked about there in that moment. And you can see it's sort of like, well, why do we have one of those? Thell is asking, right? That if we're supposed to go into the world of creation and create, why do we have this kind of curtain of flesh that has to be broken? And that hurts really bad when it is broken. As Rachel says, quote, or Raquel, Rachel, if that's how you pronounce your name, quote, it is this sexual message, which is so opposite to her character until now, it's just unthinkable to her character until now, that sends her running. I couldn't agree more. As she finally flees back to the gates in the valley beyond. So it is sexual design, right? Especially that freaks her out. And I don't think it's all that surprising when you think of the number of times she's referred to as, quote, the virgin, right? She fears again, and I think this is very important, not death, because she's aware that in the veils of horror she will pass away as rainbows pass away. But she feels, she fears this sort of disuse in which her existence has been utterly pointless and weightless. And she feels as though she's been shrunk down to just this airy presence that has no substance in the world, right? And she resists that, right? And what I want to suggest to you is that as much as she fears that, she doesn't fear it as much as she does, as it turns out. What she has seen here fearfully is the consequences of the alternative, which is plunging into the world of experience. And what are those consequences? Well, they're traumatic, right? It specifically here, this is what makes her bolt. It's the trauma of sexual initiation, which it could be argued is perhaps experience at its scariest and most intense. Okay, great. Leaving Blake behind for the moment, we'll probably be going back to Blake now and then for purposes of illuminating contrast. It's about time we got to Wordsworth. We're not going to really get to Wordsworth very much this week, though, as you've already perhaps noticed. We're going to have a slightly shorter micro lecture. I'll bet you're not terribly aggrieved about that. But let's at least get a beginning on Wordsworth. Where do you begin? And I want to make this nice little continuity, perhaps, between Blake and Wordsworth in this larger romantic project, it seems to me, of opposing the Enlightenment ennobling of reason to this position of unquestioned a monarch on the throne of human being, right? You remember Blake's attitude towards all that. You remember his attitude towards reason, your reason, right? He actually has a character called Your Reason, who is not a very attractive character in his prophetic poems, right? Which we only read one of them, Vision, and he is father of jealousy is the position. That's the name under which he goes, or the name he goes by for Athun, right? In the visions. But you remember Blake's attitude towards this figure. It's ultimately mixed, right? Because reason does have a role, as I've been trying to suggest to you, but it's pretty negative on the whole. When you look at our established enlightenment habits, our enlightenment habits are such that reason has been put on the throne, as I said above everything else, the body, imagination, energy, all experience that is not of reason has been subordinated to reason by Blake thinks, and not just Blake, as it turns out, Wordsworth as well. And this might just be one of those definitive qualities of the romantic, is the romantic believes, whatever else he believes or she believes, the romantic believes that reason has been put in this position that is just not a very healthy position for reason to occupy in human life. Above all, Wordsworth once reasoned, Wordsworth, Blake, all romantics, the romantic once reasoned, deposed from the throne upon which the Enlightenment has placed it. And once, in the case I'm here, I'm getting Blake in, imagination and energy given more pride of place. We have maybe nature instead of imagination and energy that will be given a little bit more pride of place in Wordsworth, but don't discount imagination. He doesn't talk as much about energy per se, but it's more imagination and nature working together and working, again, it's not like he wants you to be irrational or stupid. He just wants you not to allow your reason. And what he means by that is like your analytical mind, which is so suspicious of appearances and so suspicious of conclusions, to get in the way of what can become very obvious to you as you walk out into the natural world and allow your imagination freedom. That's Wordsworth. I thought Anna was a good person to turn to on this question, and we're going to end with what she had to say and with one stanza from one of the poems that I had you read for this week. Anna wrote, "The main factor in Wordsworth's poems that challenges the rationality of the Enlightenment is his trust in nature as a source of good. This is not something that would occur to most Enlightenment folks who thought of nature as just this place where we happen to be with our rational minds, and that we needed to subdue it and subordinate it to rational courses of action, right? Wordsworth does not think so. While the Enlightenment placed emphasis on science and reason, indeed, Wordsworth and Romanticism at large lean into the superstitious, the natural, the nostalgic aspects of man. The poem entitled, quote, Lines Written in Early Spring is a great example of Wordsworth challenging the ideas of the Enlightenment. Quote, To her fair works did nature link the human soul that through me ran, and much it grieved my heart to think what man has made of man. Now, Wordsworth's ideas here contrast to that of the Enlightenment, Anna has to say, and I'm going to give you a quick gloss on Anna's claim here. Enlightenment thinkers tended to see moral ideas, like, ethical notions that we might have, that everybody is created equal and that we ought to treat people well, follow the golden rule, those kinds of ideas that most of us hold to. Enlightenment thinkers tended to see such ideas as just innate. They're just in us when we're born. We're all born with a set of these ideas, and as soon as we become rational beings, they are allowed free exercise, right? So it's part of your rational nature to be a moral being. Nature has no role. If anything, you have to go against this natural acquisitiveness, where you're like a shark out there wanting to just eat everything you see. That's how they tend to be more like the French naturalists or the American naturalists in their sense of nature, the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century. Whereas Enlightenment thinkers, they see moral ideas humanly innate, or as quite a different notion, acquired only by way of instruction, right? You don't have anything inside you at all. They kind of go on both extremes on this question, right, of morality. We're born with a blank slate. You remember this, right? You remember the tabula rasa, John Locke. We have this blank slate for a mind, and culture needs to, right? Rational culture needs to write these moral rules for us and convince us of their truth, right? Because we're not born with anything that's going to direct us one way or the other. So those are the two extremes of the Enlightenment view of the world and the view of our moral beings in the world. Now, romantics like Wordsworth believe that, yes, we bring something to the table, like that first group of Enlightenment thinkers, But what we bring is a feeling, imagining heart, right? Not a starkly rational mind. And that we're better taught by way of natural sensual experience than by way of classroom abstraction, okay? And you can see how they sort of want to go in one direction, the one enlightenment direction that has to do with stuff being sort of innate. But it's not your mind. It's not your mind that sees the reason in these moral ideas. It's more like what you feel, right? You just have this feeling. And this feeling that you have that certain, for example, that people ought to be treated well, right? That, you ought to be nice to people for the most part and not eat them alive, when you have a choice, right? That we don't need to be convinced of that. We just feel it, right? We have an intuition of it. And that's kind of given us, right? Given us by God, by whoever. Maybe it's part of our natural birthright. They believe as well that nature is very helpful in our developing, okay, those intuitive moral ideas that we have, those ideas that we have by way of intuition as opposed to by rational instruction. So if you're going to have a teacher, it's good to have a teacher. Better to turn to nature than to like the old books in the classroom that will teach you by way of argumentation, convince you of the truth of moral conduct, why it's a good idea to be moral. Now, you just be natural. Just obey your heart and go out into the world of nature especially, outside of human cultures, and look at nature and look at how you feel in nature and look at how nature harmonizes, right? How the trees, the birds in the trees and the winds blowing through the trees and all the beauty and the birds and singing and all the rest in this happy world out there. That's where we can be taught. Right. And one vernal, well, I'm getting to this in a moment. I almost quoted the stanza at the end of this plate. But before I do, let's go back to what Anne had to say. Wordsworth believes in the power of nature. He's not afraid to show it. Let nature be your teacher. Right. The last stanza echoes the sentiment of the previous line. Enough of science. Now she's talking about a different poem. You know which one. Enough of science and of art. Wordsworth's turning the tables on his interlocutor of the previous poem. Right, which is expostulation in reply. Enough of science and of art. Close up those barren leaves. Come forth and bring with you a heart that watches and receives. Okay, so you go out into nature and you receive instruction from nature. You watch nature, you receive instruction. Very nice things come out of this, right? A very developed heart, a very developed moral sense comes out of this, right? So Wordsworth doesn't have a lot of faith in the intellectualism of the Enlightenment, as Anna puts it, science and art. Art, I wonder about that's its position right there, Anna, but let's go on. And believes that nature is a true teacher and cure. And I think he would say that art, that products of the imagination rooted in nature, which we could call like really great paintings of whatever, nature, but maybe even paintings that are not explicitly of nature, or maybe even portraits that are somehow rooted in this, in this upbringing, this natural upbringing, I think can serve the interests of nature and of the heart, rather than the intellect. Okay, so I'm just going to close by reading one stanza, from the same poem. One impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can, than all those old intellectuals writing their philosophical treatises on why it's good to be good, right? Or even a lot of like religious and theological thought, the religious sages. No, just get out into the natural world and groove out there, and you're probably going to be a lot better person for that, and a better person for that than you would be for sitting down with a bunch of books. Okay, so this is just the beginning of our journey through Wordsworth. There's lots more coming. So I'll leave you alone at this point. Have a good week.